Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Stephen Hazel. I'm Emeritus Professor of Government and Economics and Director of the Global Policy Institute in London, and I'm here instead of Chris Lunan, who works with me, but you have me instead of him today chairing this. I can give my thoughts on this subject. Can I first of all introduce the panel? And if you can just, because I'm not sure on what line everybody is, let me start with. This comes up here, does it?
That's right.
Okay. See up here. Well, it's up there. You can't read it very well, but Charles Hecker, just Charles. There we are. Who is Global Research Director at Control Risks. In this role, he is responsible for shaping control risk leadership on geopolitics, global security, macroeconomics, and political risk methodology issues and their impact on international business. Then we have Marko Papic. Marko here is Chief Geopolitical Strategist, BCA Research, which he joined in September 2011. Marko launched Geopolitical Strategy in March 2012, a service that blends BCA's macroeconomic research with geopolitical methodology, with the goal of avoiding bias, well done there, and providing investment-relevant forecasts. Then we have Mujtaba Rahman, who is the Practice Head Europe for the Eurasia Group. Mujtaba, at the far right. He focuses on European political economy. In addition to leading Eurasia Group's Europe practice, Mujtaba has primary responsibility for all aspects of EU Eurozone coverage, as well as leading country coverage on Greece, Cyprus, and the UK. Finally, Graham Bishop is a consultant on EU integration and founder of GrahamBishop.com. In this country, Graham is a well-known consultant, speaker, media commentator, author of books and articles, and as it says here, his expertise, I know this is true, and interests have spanned financial markets, economic budgetary policy, and the issue of democracy. Okay, well, what's going to happen here is I'm going to speak for about 10 minutes, give an overview of the geopolitical situation. Then I'm going to ask our panelists to comment on what I've said, and then when they finish their comments, we'll have some specific questions for them, and then we'll have at the end a Q&A, and we'll finish this session at 9:40 or so. Is that right? Yes, okay. Well, let me start by saying that the organisers have, in my view, very wisely decided to start this conference with the issue of geopolitics, the subject of geopolitics, the political environment and the structural environment in which we live and which is the backdrop now to many of the other issues, perhaps all the other issues, more specific issues we're going to discuss later in the conference. So I'm going to be very general, because this is a general subject, and I've been asked to be general about it, to give an overview. But this is now coming back as a serious subject to study, political risk environment, and there are many obvious reasons for that. I'm going to divide my short talk now into long-term trends, and then the second half, last 5 minutes, short-term trends. Let me start with the fundamentals, as far as I see them in the structure of the political economy. And I'm starting with the global financial system, which I think is fundamental to it. I would argue the global financial system remains seriously unstable and vulnerable to unforeseen shocks. And that the crisis that hit us all in 2007-8 has not ultimately been resolved or stabilized even over the long term. just a few points to make that, to give colour to that general proposition. This is a deleveraging crisis we're going through, supposedly. A de-debting crisis, supposedly. But it's a deleveraging crisis in which debt levels are going up. In many sectors, debt levels are rising rather than falling. Banks remain vulnerable, and we have in the Eurozone now a problem of Southern Europe versus Northern Europe, the question of Greece, the question of Eurozone governments struggling, seriously struggling with the austerity program, deficit reduction, of which Greece is only the first, and the whole issue now centre stage of the growth of political resistance to austerity programs. And one of the big issues for risk analysis, investors, is how serious is this political resistance program? Is it something that's going to go away? Will political resistance dissolve in the Eurozone over time? Will the Germans be able to fudge the whole issue? Will the new Greek government, potentially a similar government in Spain after December, will they ultimately be able to fudge and compromise? Or are we going to see something which is not a compromise and not a fudge? And there are different views on this on the panel. So my point basically is the global system remains extremely vulnerable and unstable. And I would also like to add to that as a general proposition that, and this is again a controversial point, but I think it's a background point I want to make, that the whole era of globalization, which essentially we've been living with, growing slowly since the Second World War, but speedily since 1989, the whole system of globalization, in my view, has reached its limits. The rise of China and the BRICS and their challenge to the liberal order and to US hegemony is serious, and it means that when we look at the structure of the world now, we're not really looking at a flat world, so-called, a globalized world. We are looking at a multipolar world with the emergence, the serious emergence now, in my view, of blocs, which will negotiate with each other, essentially, rather than a single globalized system. The idea of a single globalized system based around the United States and United States hegemony became very fashionable after 1989. The famous idea put forward by Charles Krauthammer, US political scientist, when he argued that we were going through a unipolar moment, basically a world governed by Washington and Wall Street and the values and attitudes they had. But I would argue that this was a moment, indeed only a moment. Unipolarity has never been able to fully establish itself, and the underlying move towards a more regionalized and multipolar order has continued. This trend, however, has rapidly speeded up in recent years, especially since the Iraq War in 2003 and the global economic and financial crisis that started in 2007. So, I think we live in a world now, rather than looking at it as a globalized system, basically run and controlled and with authority determined out of the West. We are now looking at general challenges to the Western-centric order, challenges that have not yet changed the system radically, but are there. And of course we're looking at the BRICS and others. East Asia, Pacific, and/or China-only initiatives are contributing to undermining both US hegemony and the Western-led liberal order, and going to a large the dollar with China, Iran, and others. New Development Bank, NDB, also known as BRICS Bank, capitalized with $100 billion, BRICS Interbank Cooperation Mechanism, and lots of others. Are we seeing a fundamental challenge to the globalized order run out of the US? Other challenges to this Western-centric globalized system we've been in. Numerous bilateral currency swap arrangements, purchase of huge amounts of gold, various bilateral deals to obtain natural resources outside normal market mechanisms, bilateral trade deals such as China, Russia, Iran, even China, Japan, avoiding trading in US dollars. And at the same time as we're seeing this, in my view, we are seeing politically what I would not call the growth of US isolationism, but I certainly would call it the growth of US retrenchment. The US itself is there's a recognition in the United States that it is in a relative declining situation. Latterly recognized, in my view, or rather the overextension of the United States, which we saw in dramatic form in 2007-8, now at least recognized during the Obama administration. So rather than producing a non-polar or G0 world, as many people argue, it appears that instead of a single globalized world run out of the West, it appears that a new bipolarity is taking shape, with one pole made up of the US and possibly transatlantic alliance on the one hand, and another pole, China, and an emerging Eurasian bloc with the BRICS as possible partners. Okay, now if that's a potentially developing structure, a new bipolar system that China is going to propose, what about the forgotten continent? Always forgotten. Ryan was always interested in this. Europe, the forgotten continent. Now, whether such a new bipolar world will emerge will not least depend on Europe, or rather the European Union, or even just the Eurozone, depending on whether the Eurozone can stay together and find genuine solutions to its internal challenges. Europe could become a third bloc. Still possible. And that's why one of the central questions I'm going to ask when we get to the panel is how is this European integration system going? Are the big problems emerging in Greece and Spain and Italy and Germany forcing European integration forward or weakening? Because it could go either way. The problems we have in Europe. But upon Can I now, let's go to the panel and basically ask them if they'd like to talk about those general points and maybe pick on one or two that they want to develop, but they'll have other chances to do that as well. But first of all, let's go to Marco, and you can pick up some of the points and make some points.
Okay, thank you very much. What I would really emphasize from the geopolitical side for investors is to really think about geopolitical risk in terms of both probability and market impact. And so what I mean by that is that we could sit here and essentially talk about the Middle East the entire morning, because the probability of something blowing up in the Middle East today or tomorrow is 100%. The market impact, of course, would be a lot less significant. And that's why I want to address the sort of global risks very briefly in my opening remarks in terms of that balance between probability and market impact. So first of all, I think that Professor has really made a very important point about multipolarity. I think multipolarity defines the current system, and it's been proven theoretically and empirically to be incompatible with globalization. The reason it's incompatible with globalization is because globalization, which in economics is defined as essentially movement of goods, finance, and people, requires a hegemon to provide a certain level of stability. This is not a normative argument that I'm making. I'm not trying to say that we need American hegemony. We could use Chinese or British or alien life force that takes over Earth and provides us with the rules and norms under which the rest of the world operates. This is very good because it provides a hegemonic stability that allows the rest of the world to basically eschew challenges to that hegemon and then proceed accordingly. We no longer live in this world, and we're in a world that's very similar to the 19th century, where the Germans began looking for their place in the sun. This is now happening across the world, and it challenges the fundamental order. So that's the first point I want to say. The second point where I would disagree with your opening remarks in East Asia. It's not on the front it's not on the front pages of the newspapers. There's no beheadings going on there. There's no Greek crises. It seems like the situation has calmed down after the APEC summit between China and the U.S. But the reality is that there is a disequilibrium in the region. China is clearly a regional leader, if not a hegemon already. The U.S. is unwilling to accept that reality, as are, most importantly, Chinese neighbors as well. And they're beginning to invite the United States into the region militarily. Alliances are being reformed, reforged, or forged anew, such as the case with Vietnam in the U.S. And this is a very concerning for me, because we are in a moment when a mistake can devolve into a regional crisis. Not a full-scale war. However, remember again, geopolitical risk is a combination of both probability and market impact. And even if there was a minor skirmish, you tell me how the market would react to that. If, for example, a Chinese and American vessels were to impact one another, as we almost came, as it almost came to be in December of 2013, when there was an incident in the South China Sea between the two navies, where they came 200 yards ahead of impact. So the reality is that East Asia is a cauldron of a disequilibrium, and I think investors underestimate the probability of a crisis because there's this belief that economic interdependence is correlated with peace. And we know from political science research that no such correlation has actually been proven. It's very difficult to do so, and there's many cases that run counter to that. Furthermore, I think the tensions in East Asia will only underpin that erosion of globalization that is definitely already happening. You can calculate it, you can measure it. You can see, for example, that global trade is now growing at a smaller clip than global GDP, which is the first time in basically 20 years that has happened. Global FDI, growth of global FDI has also tapered off, and movement of labor as well. And the final point I want to say is emerging markets. We all know that there's headwinds, both secular and cyclical, to emerging market economies. This is what is currently happening. It's the hot topic at our shop at BCA Research. But what's also very concerning to me is that emerging markets don't have the social shock absorbers, the type of automatic stabilizers that Europe has. The reason all the forecasts of orgies of violence that would descend upon the European continent, the reason all those forecasts were absolutely incorrect is because Europe has 7% of global population and 50% of its social welfare spending. Emerging markets have nowhere near that. Emerging market middle classes or middle classes of consumption, not wealth. They have very few safety nets. And so what I worry about in 2015 is not Greece, is not Europe, is not American politics. Middle East is here nor there. Not even Ukraine. What I worry about is the rising political risk, domestic political risk in emerging markets that could precipitate a further decline in emerging market assets across the board. And that's why we maintain a decade theme, investment theme, of being long developed markets where political risks are overstated and short emerging markets where political risks are woefully understated.
Thank you very much. Marco, I think Charles Hecker wants to say something, I think, on globalization at this stage, whether you agree with that thesis or not, and then we'll come back to the more specific things later.
Yeah, thank you, Stephen. First of all, two very brief opening remarks, an apology for comments delivered through a head cold and a nasal tone of voice, so apologies for that. And also, though, an expression of gratitude. Stephen's right. It's good to know that geopolitics is back and that people care about it. And I would say that over the past 2 years, it's been very refreshing to sort of be let out of our boxes to talk about these issues and to sort of let our inner politics geek out. And people actually care about what we have to say. So thank you for caring about geopolitics. I'll pick up on globalization. And for the sake of creative tension, I would love to disagree with you. But I'll agree with you and try to take it a couple of steps further if I can. The source of tension that we see for 2015 and its connection to globalization really can be expressed in two different ways. And the first one is that this tension that we see emerging and developing between the worlds of business and politics. And these are sort of global trends that I want to talk about. And we find ourselves scratching our heads and wondering in this world, in this globalized world, whether it's reaching its limits or not, who's calling the shots anymore? Is it people who bump into each other in business class lounges, depending upon your company's travel policy? Or is it people who roam the corridors of ministerial palaces and government buildings? And who's really in charge in those two spheres? And we think that in the coming year and in the coming years, the tension between those two circles is going to grow. Business and politics look at the world in a fundamentally different way. For business, the fewer borders, the fewer restrictions, the fewer lines on the map, the better. And we have this vocabulary that shows the way we look at the world. We're not looking at countries, we're looking at geomarkets. We're talking about LATAM, we're talking about EMEA, we're talking about Asia-Pac. We have boards of directors that have people from lots of different countries. We have listings in different countries from our headquarters, and we raise financing in places other than where we have our listings. And the fewer obstacles to that sort of way of thinking and that way of working from the business perspective, the better. The problem is that countries care all about those lines on the map, and they care about them more and more. And they want a say in how domestic laws are enacted. They want a say in how their borders are enforced, and they want a say in how their economies are governed. And I think they feel their ability to exert influence on these matters being eroded by globalization. And so that's why I think we're seeing the limits of globalization. And I think the symptoms, well, two important things. First of all, in this conflict between business and politics, it's global companies that are in the crosshairs. They become the scapegoats. They become the victims. They become the subjects of scrutiny when business and politics collide. And I think that the way nations fight back, and so the second sort of trend for 2015, and one that is I think the symptom of the pushback against globalization, is nationalism. And I think we see nationalism manifesting itself in three important ways, and I'll try at the end of all this to say why it matters to businesses and why it affects the way businesses function, particularly in emerging markets, but not exclusively in emerging markets. First of all, there's the expression of nationalism in this sort of global and regional assertiveness on behalf of certain countries. And it's no surprise that I'm talking about Russia here, which is seeking, one of the sort of narrative arcs to Russia's behavior these days is the reassertion of its influence in its backyard and globally, and the rebuilding of empire. No great secrets there. But certainly that's a type of nationalism that we see that's affecting geopolitics and affecting our ability to do business in that part of the world effectively. It's also no surprise to talk about China as a country that's also becoming globally and regionally much more assertive in the way it conducts itself, and particularly its behavior in maritime waters in the region. And it's interesting to see that China gets assertive in its maritime zones, and then you get these hostile reactions in Vietnam where you have Chinese factories attached. That's a symptom of a conflict and tension in globalization. We also think that nationalism is being put up, nationalist sentiment is being put up in countries that are experiencing economic difficulties and economic slowdowns, and that they're being used as diversionary tactics. So your currency's under attack. Well, it's an international banking conspiracy. Your labor market's eroding. Well, it's immigration. And that what the political elite is doing in countries, perhaps again like Russia, perhaps Turkey comes to mind in a situation like this, is using a certain amount of nationalist rhetoric to distract a disaffected middle class that had become accustomed to a certain sustainable amount of growth and a feeling of wealth and empowerment. But when the bottom drops out of that, you get a restive and disaffected middle class that needs to be distracted from domestic political difficulties with nationalist rhetoric. And it's reasonably effective. It's working. And then finally, and I'll move on and pass the comments back to our moderator, but all across Europe and in other places around the world, we're seeing the emergence of nationalist political forces that for the moment, and this is something else that Stephen alluded to in his remarks, that for the moment we could classify as fringe, but they have this way of becoming the tail that wags the dog, and the way they're dominating national and to a smaller degree international political conversation and parliamentary debate. And generally speaking, these are anti-global forces. And so to bring it all back to what it means about companies and our ability to do business is that nationalism is gradually skewing the playing field, and it's affecting the political environment, the legal environment, the regulatory environment, and the environment of public sentiment towards international investors and towards foreign companies who, again, find themselves in the crosshairs of these sorts of conversations. And so there are crackdowns on foreign investors and anti-corruption campaigns that primarily target foreign investors or inconvenient political enemies. And we think that this is a fairly significant source of risk for the coming period, and draw your attention to it because of the way that it can impact companies' ability to function, particularly in unstable emerging markets. And I'll leave it at that and pass things on.
Thank you very much for that. Now, can I ask, and thank you for those comments on globalization. It's a theme which I'm sure we want to develop over the coming weeks and months. Ms. Turner, can I ask you to comment on your expertise on Europe? Would you like to comment on this argument I put forward that ultimately it's going to be fudged and ultimately there's a compromise? Maybe you agree with that, and maybe you'd like to develop that argument.
Sure, thank you. So every year Eurasia Group publishes its top 10 geopolitical risks for the year ahead. For 2015, our top risk is actually the politics of Europe. I think for a number of different reasons. We think the outlook for the European Union and the euro area in particular is particularly negative. I think we're particularly bearish for 2015. I think as we see it, there are 3 or 4 critical areas of stress. One is obviously the debate on growth and inflation. I can talk about that in a bit more detail perhaps later. Clearly the ECB moving forward with monetary easing, but there are big concerns over fiscal policy. Then, as our chair alluded to, some of the problems that we're seeing manifest in the southern periphery. I mean, anybody who's looking at the Greece issue closely and believes what we got over the last 2 weeks was a compromise, I don't think is interpreting the story in the right way. I think Greece essentially did 99% of what Germany was asking for. There's a very big question as to whether the deal that's been put together is sustainable. In our own view, it's not, and I think we're likely heading into an environment of much more domestic political stress in Athens over the next 2 to 3 months. So there's a big question about dynamics in the southern periphery. I think we are looking at significant challenges in terms of governance, in terms of reform rollback. Arguably there is contagion. It won't be limited to Greece. I think Spain and Portugal are at risk over the course of the year as well. The next level of stress is what we're calling the outside-in risk. That's essentially the external political environment in the European near neighborhood that creates particular and disproportionate stress for Europe. Russia, Ukraine is obviously the critical example here. If you look at what Russia wants and what Ukraine can give, these things do not overlap. The Venn diagram, as it were, does not overlap. I can articulate what I think those things are. Degree of federalization that the Ukrainian administration can simply not support. I think Russia also wants a structural guarantee that Ukraine will not join NATO. Again, that's not something we believe President Poroshenko can deliver. There are obviously serious reservations with the deep and comprehensive free trade agreement that the Ukrainians are about to sign with the European Union. At the end of the year, the Russians have clear reservations about those things. There's no convergence on any of those 3 issues. No reason to believe these sides are moving closer together in that environment. We believe Russia's best strategy will remain essentially what we call invasion from within, and that will be met by additional sanctions both from the European Union and the US. There's obviously the IS risk, disenfranchised Islamic communities within the European Union. We've seen attacks in France. I think we believe the risk of terrorist attacks across the EU over the course of this year is significant, as well as in countries like Turkey that are not EU members but are clearly struggling with this issue. That's the outside-in risk. And then the last level of stress, I think, is what we call the intra-EU risk, and that's essentially a function of the fact Germany is strong and all the other critical states in Europe are weak. I mean, if you look at the constellation of countries that matter, I mean, in France, we have a weak president, divided socialist party. We don't think the reform agenda is going to really move forward in a meaningful way, and we don't really think France is affecting the debate at EU level in a meaningful way. If you look at Italy, well, we have Matteo Renzi, smart, young, has significant popularity, certainly compared to his peers. The point is he's focused on a domestic reform agenda, not really influencing the debate at EU level in a meaningful way. The Brits are very disengaged. I mean, we have an election this year. Our own base case for that election is we're going to get a return of the coalition that will deliver a referendum in 2017. So we think this existential question over the UK's membership of the EU will remain live over the next 2 years. We don't really see the UK affecting the debate in the EU in a meaningful way. Poland, I mean, okay, growing in influence, Donald Tusk heading the European Council. The point is they're largely on board with Germany's agenda. So I think all of these issues, whether it's governance in the southern periphery, Russia, Ukraine, dealing with growth and inflation, we're very negative on Europe's ability to address those issues, primarily because when you look at the constellation of states in the EU, Germany is strong, everybody else is weak. That means Germany's preferences will prevail, and I don't think Germany's preferences are a recipe for success over some of those challenges that I've outlined. I'll stop there and can pick up any of those issues in the Q&A or with other panelists afterwards.
Probably would like to respond to some of those things,
Yeah.
in terms of the European stability.
Yes, I think I would rather like to. First of all, we've all heard of the problems of the euro and of Europe. I'd like just to ask some questions of the audience. How many of you think that the euro's design is flawed? Hands up for flawed. That looks like pretty overwhelming. And therefore, how many think that the euro is doomed? That's not...
2, 3.
That's not quite so overwhelming. And how many of you have actually made money overall trading that view that the euro has a real problem? Do I see one hand?
Can I have your name after the conference, please?
Is it two, right. So I'm not going to ask who's lost money, because I think that might be a bit embarrassing by the sound of it. So the question is, why have you not made money from this very strongly held view? And the answer is very simple. I don't have a PowerPoint, but you won't really be able to see this chart. There's a handy little chart from the ECB of an index of integration from 1957, the beginning of the EU. Starts at 5, and it goes in pretty much a straight line up to 72 at the latest reading. 100 is the maximum. And the paradox of this is that when the crisis broke, there was a sharp acceleration in integration. And that is continuing. You'll probably be aware that the 4 presidents wrote a report in 2012, and that really got shelved. They're going to write another report, and actually the pen is held by Juncker, who is turning out to be very, very influential on this. The pen is going to be held by him, and they will report to the June summit of heads of government. If you read the preparatory material, this is creating another wave of integration. And we've already got political integration has come through banking union. The Greeks have just found out what banking union means as a political union. The ECB, the SSM, is the supervisor of their banks. If they don't play ball, give in 99%. I don't disagree with that view. If they don't do that, their banks are finished. And if their banks are finished, so is their payment system. The Greek economy is in a state of collapse of which we have not seen in the Western world for a long, long time. If Greece were to leave the euro, the circumstances would be such that far from other people thinking they might do the same, nobody would ever want to go near that. So this degree of political integration is moving ahead quickly. We have, as a banking union, capital market union is coming, energy union is coming as a stabilization against the East, against Russia. The role of Mr. Putin, first of all, the role of Greece in triggering closer political union in the Eurozone is quite dramatic. The role of Mr. Putin in accelerating this is going to be even more dramatic. That's energy union. That's France and Germany. We've heard that the French are not pulling their weight. That's absolutely the case. But what is really interesting is that Merkel and Hollande went to see Putin as Europe, not Britain at all. The two of them went, and it looks as though Hollande came away with a much better relationship with Mrs. Merkel, Chancellor Merkel. Have the Germans been complaining about the French getting an extra year or two? Not particularly, not the bare minimum of complaint. So the Franco-German axis may be restarting again after an unfortunate lag. If it does, watch this space from June onwards. The integration will happen, and with it there will be the UK becomes ever more marginalized. We're pretty marginal already. That is one of the biggest risks around. But the risk of the euro breaking up, very, very small now. The Greeks have demonstrated, they have learnt as their bank deposits bled by the billion, that you can't get out of this. And they're going to toe the available lines, and they will get the money. They will get whatever is needed to see them through.
Thank you, Graham. Well, look, we're going to, at one point I'd just like to ask a further point, detailed point. Many people compare the Greek crisis, potential Greek crisis, to Lehman Brothers, and the effect of the default of Lehman Brothers on the global economy. No one seems to be able to answer this question. Are we looking at something of the same order of a Lehman Brothers collapse and default as far as Greece is concerned? Is this the same order of things, or is it a different order of things?
Well, it's not now. The SSM has gone through, the ECB, the single supervisory mechanism, has gone through all the banks, and if any bank is left which is destabilized by Greece exiting the euro, etc., and defaulting completely, then that would be a major failure by the ECB.
If I can just add to that, the global private banking sector owns 18 billion of Greek debt. I mean, it's tiny. It's insignificant. All of it is now official sector debt. So So no. And you can see, I think the market is reacting the same way.
Yeah.
The yields haven't budged, the equities haven't budged.
Okay.
And that's,
now, we've got about 10 minutes, and I want to open this to the floor if there's any questions anyone wants to ask. We've had a bit of a cant around the course, I'm afraid, dealing with a lot of issues, because this is about sort of basically global politics, but we focus on Europe as well. If there's any particular questions anyone wants to ask, please, now's the chance, and we can bring our experts in. Anything we've mentioned, people want to ask a question, I can see you've got your hands up. Hold on. Yes, there's one over here. Is this it? Yes, this is it. Just give your name, please.
well, I think definitely my comment was both to explain why Europe didn't blow up, if you will, after a generational crisis. The reason the social welfare spending is so high is because Europe learned the lessons, I guess, of the 1930s and interpreted them in a certain way. But it's also definitely a risk factor to sustainability of government debt. There's a great statement from former economist in the Nixon White House, Herb Stein, which is that cannot go on will stop. And so what I would say about public expenditure in the euro area, in the US, in Canada, in the United Kingdom as well, is that ultimately it will have to be renegotiated, in other words. This idea that there are entitlements, as we call it in the US, nobody is entitled to anything if there's no money. In the U.S. specifically, it will mean a fundamental restructuring of the healthcare system. It will mean eventually some form of, socialized healthcare. It will mean that the government will set the prices for that healthcare, and that those prices are going to be really low. In Europe, I think you will see more and more of financial repression. You will see, I think that's ultimately the end result. And somebody will have to pay, if you will, for the structural reforms. And those structural reforms will take a long time. But who will pay for that? Central banks. Also, government spending is likely to come back. I think all policymakers in the developed world are going to look to Abe. He's someone who has been very successful with his populism. And I think that we will see the return of both government spending and further monetary policy activism together to combine to give the time for structural reforms. What does this mean? Well, if our view that globalization is collapsing is correct, then over the next 5 to 10 years, not necessarily 3 to 5, but 5 to 10 years, I think you will see a return at some point of inflationary forces. So that's what I would say. I mean, that's the bottom line of everything, because that's the only way to ultimately make it sustainable.
Does anybody on the panel take a view about the continuing austerity programs in Europe? Are we going to ever get to the end of these? I mean, Graham's going to come in maybe now and say there's all great green shoots appearing in Spain and everything, but I'm not sure. How sure are you of that? And can I just ask the panel whether they think if austerity does continue, do you think it will at some point meet some kind of political resistance? Which would challenge it. So, I mean, Graham, do you want to say something about that?
Yeah. Well, I agree with the green shoots, of course, as you put the words in my mouth.
Yeah.
But it's not just austerity. This is something which people have failed to take on board. It is economic reform on a grand scale. Mrs. Thatcher's economics are being applied to the whole of the Eurozone. That may not be terribly popular, but it's happening. And in the UK, going back, I was there as a student, etc., going back to the mid-80s, the miners' strike, privatization, all these sort of things happened. And the UK economy, first of all, began to show productivity rates which were undreamt of. Secondly, growth came back with it. And thirdly, tax revenues rose and budgets actually moved into cash surplus briefly. And that's what's happening across Europe with the European semester, the six-pack, two-pack, etc. This is a tremendous change, but it takes a little while.
I think you're right about the radical nature of these reforms, and there was a bit of a gasp around here when you talked about Thatcherism being enforced throughout Europe. But my problem is this with that, and this is the issue I think we face. Does there come a point at which these reforms, which you admit are very radical, meet political resistance? And one party or other, whether it's the Greeks, whether it's the Spanish Podemos party that has come from nowhere and is a challenging party now in the election at the end of the year, whether it's Mr. Pepe Grillo in Italy, whether indeed it's changes as well in France. I mean, Marine Le Pen. Do you not see that if these structural reforms are not able to bear fruition quickly, and they rarely are,
Yeah.
could there be serious political resistance? Is that an issue that I think you ought to think about? I mean, those are the alternatives.
Well, just to be very brief, European Commission President Juncker, when he was Prime Minister of Luxembourg, said of all these reforms, we all know what's got to be done, but none of us know how to be re-elected afterwards.
Yeah, that's the point.
And he lost the next election.
All right. Do you want to come in on this?
Well, just very briefly, I mean, right now we have a fiscal bailout mechanism. We've had euro area member states bailed out directly by other member states, which is illegal. And we have the ECB buying government bonds as a matter of regular monetary policy to regulate prices. These are three red lines the Germans had, and they've been crossed. So I think to answer your question, will we have a change on austerity and budget discipline? My definitive answer is absolutely. The Germans have already crossed every red line they've ever had, so why wouldn't they cross it on government spending as well? It's not going to be a massive stimulus, but, austerity is already over. It's budget discipline, in fact. I mean, no one's really cutting budgets anymore. Commission just gave France another free pass.
Which tab would you want?
Yeah, if I could just come in on that. I mean, I think when you look at the macroeconomic policy mix in the euro area, I think most people would argue that the aggregate fiscal stance in the euro area is not supportive to the economic recovery. If anything, it's a drag on growth and remains a drag on growth, and actually could, in a very meaningful way, undermine the ultimate effectiveness of the ECB's monetary easing. Now, the problem when you look at the fiscal stance in the euro area, especially in Germany, is that over the course of, we have a grand coalition in Germany, over the course of 2014, everything this grand coalition did in terms of policy was social democrat priorities. It's pension reform, minimum wage, the energy U-turn. These are all SPD priorities. Yes. This year in 2015, the CDU, Merkel's party, is essentially saying, look, it's time that we deliver on our own policy priorities, and top of that list is a balanced budget in Germany over the course of this year, even if that does not make sense for Germany domestically, even if it does not make sense for the aggregate, for the euro area in the aggregate. So I think little or no fiscal expansion from Germany will limit what the euro area can do writ large. I mean, when you talk to senior German policymakers, the view is we can't force water on everybody else and drink wine ourselves, even if everybody is asking Germany to drink wine. So I don't think we see significant fiscal stimulus in Germany. I don't think we see it in the euro area writ large. I think we are seeing a gradual easing of fiscal consolidation, but fiscal consolidation remains the order of the day, and that's being driven by German political priorities and is actually institutionalized in EU fiscal rules.
All right, well, it's all to play for, in my view. We'll wait and see the outcome of that, but at least I think we've set the debate in context, which is austerity, fiscal consolidation continues, but also there will be parties opposed to this, of course, and we shall see how that turns out. Okay, Charles, do you want to say anything at the end of this final comment on anything at all, because I've kept you out of this a bit.
I get a free card to close with anything, and I feel like, no, I think that we've already seen, and we're already seeing the political resistance to austerity, whether it's the vocal expression of fringe parties or the discontented middle class that I alluded to. It's already all around us. And I think
general growth and inequality everywhere.
Sorry?
Growth and inequality everywhere.
Yeah, well, we can talk. Income inequality is another one of those things that we could spend the rest of the morning talking about. But I think that there's pushback against austerity, and more specifically, and a more potent force really, is this pushback against the low growth environment and the political unrest that's causing.
Okay. Well, can I? We bring this to a close now. This first session. Can I thank our panelists? We've tried to make the point, and fortunately we've had rather too many topics to discuss, really, rather than concentrating on one, although we have tended to concentrate on Europe. Tried to make the point that politics is back, geopolitics is back, and that you simply cannot look at the world anymore. I think this is the concluding point I'd like to bring out of this. You cannot look at the world anymore simply run on the basis of economic theory and economic postulates. We have to look at the political environment. You have to look at the social environment as well. When you're looking at risk, when you're looking at potential investment, and all that, and that perhaps over the last 20, 30 years, certainly since the end of the Cold War, we've tried to put politics aside, political developments aside, political risk not aside, but have not treated them with the seriousness they deserve, because politics at the end of the day always comes back and bites you in the butt when you're least expecting it. So it has to be factored in to decisions about investment and decisions that businessmen take in their everyday lives. So thank you very much. Thank our panel very much. And we'll go on to the next panel now. Thank you. Thank you.